if you don't necessarily like to cook or you want to like to cook, but you're not there yet, I think the answer is to like really think of it as a practice. And it's like going to yoga. It's like brushing your teeth every day. It's like saving money. It's like, I'm sure it's like raising kids where it's like the cumulative impact of like doing it every day. That's what's going to like build the muscle and like build the desire and build the interest in doing it.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the rituals, traditions, and cultural influences around food and how food connects us and also sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. This is a space dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the podcast. I had so much fun chatting with my new guest. I think you guys are going to love this conversation. I speak with Lukas Volger, who is a cookbook author and recipe developer. He's the author of 6 cookbooks, and he writes the newsletter Family Friend by Lukas Volger, which I highly recommend. It features a lot of plant-forward, vegetable-forward recipes. Lukas and I discuss how we both developed a deep respect for recipes, and we pull back the curtain on our cookbook writing process. We get into like the logistics, the nuts and bolts of writing cookbooks, but we also share where we get our inspiration from, like how these ideas come in. And for the first time, I share the concept for my new book, which, although it is pretty much written, done, the recipes are finalized, this book doesn't come out until January of 2026. So please hang tight for that. Since cookbooks are such a labor of love and they take so much time, we discuss why our newsletters and, things like this podcast are just so joyful because it's really happening in real time. So thank you guys for being here and listening. Now, apart from talking about cookbooks, Lukas and I also dive into cooking, and he shares some really awesome tips for incorporating more vegetables into your meal routines. Because to be honest, cooking vegetables is often more work than cooking meats or obviously from pulling something from the freezer. But Lukas has some really great, simple, applicable ideas that'll make vegetarian or just more vegetable-forward cooking a lot easier. Then we dive into fall cooking. And you guys, I'm getting so excited for the flavors of fall. We both share some of the recipes we're really excited to make and simple tips and techniques that we both use to incorporate fall produce into our meals. And finally, we talk about the liberation of dropping labels when it comes to defining how we eat. It's so easy to put ourselves into these buckets of I'm a this or I'm a that. But when we drop that, we get to just eat in a way that feels best for our own bodies. And isn't that the point? To feel that freedom, that liberation, and that sovereignty, to feed ourselves in a way that is perfect for us without having to label it or define it. All right, my friends, this is a fun conversation. Please let me know if you give it a listen. You can support this work by leaving a comment, rating it, and you can subscribe to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter where I share brand new recipes each week, all of which just happen to be gluten-free. I also dive deeper into some of these concepts. And if you become a paid subscriber for just a couple of dollars a month, you get access to the full recipe archives, other fun perks, and you make all of this work possible. This podcast and my newsletter are completely funded by community support. Couldn't happen without you. And I am so, so, so grateful for all of you paid subscribers. All right, let's dive into the show. Hi, Lukas. Welcome to the show. It is such a joy to have you here.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to start by asking you the first question that I ask all my guests, and that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
So I grew up in Boise, Idaho in the 80s and 90s. And if you've ever been to Boise, it's sort of a desert climate. Idaho had been settled by Mormons. I'm not Mormon. So it's a very white, very sort of middle class, very Western in sensibility. I feel like a lot of people think Idaho is Midwest, but it's actually West. It's further west than Montana. It's further west than Colorado, but it has a very Western sensibility. So I grew up in a middle class sort of household. My dad worked sort of a corporate job for this grocery store chain called Albertsons. And then my mom, while we were young, raised us at home, worked at home, and then went out and worked once we were a little bit older. And we ate like the standard sort of American diet. It was a lot of like meat, two sides. My mom was really into like junior league cookbooks. She loved really easy recipes. She didn't ever deviate from a recipe. She wasn't like a fly by the seat of her pants sort of cook. And I feel like that for me really cultivated a lot of respect for recipes. And I remember growing up and my mom loved like magazines. And so she'd sort of sit out in the backyard in a lawn chair in the sun and move her lawn chair around as the sun shifted. And she'd just bring a stack of magazines. And some of them were food magazines. Some of them were things like Women's Weekly or People magazine that would occasionally have like recipe inserts.
Yeah.
And she always clipped out the recipes and then kept them in this like completely unwieldy like file folder that was always like ripping at the edges. But she always loved recipes, and whether or not she cooked them, it was always like, oh, there's a recipe here. That's so cool. I got to save this. And so, yeah, I feel like a very Midwestern, maybe a Midwestern in terms of like what I ate, but sort of standard American diet.
It's so interesting. Nobody's ever mentioned that respect for recipes before. And I've never thought about that for myself. And it's so true. My mom was the same way. She had a full-time job. Both my parents did. We ate a lot of fast food and a lot of takeout, but she definitely cooked. And we had the, Sunday night kind of meat and potatoes dinner. But she loved reading recipes. And same thing. She had a binder. She still does this. She tears out the recipes. She puts them in the binder. And I do the same thing. I love reading recipes. I mean, obviously we're in the food world, but I've always been like, even as a kid, I would go to her ladies' home journal and there was a food section in it. And that was the part that I found really fascinating. And it's interesting, even in reading magazines, I hate it when they put the recipes, they like shove them to the back of the book. And so it's like, I like the recipe to be part of the content because I like reading it as content, but I've never really put words into that before. So that's so cool that that sparked something for you and influenced what you do today as a recipe developer. And I'd love to hear more about that journey. Like, how did you enter the food world?
Well, one of my first jobs in high school was working at this bakery called Stone Mill Bread Company. And it started as a summer job, like maybe my junior year of high school. And I was hired to sort of work the counter, and they were primarily baking like sandwich breads. And they supplied a lot of the scones and biscotti for like one of these big chains of coffee shops around Boise. And then there was like sort of to try to drive more traffic into the shop, they started selling sandwiches. So I was hired to sort of work the counter and then make sandwiches. But I always wanted to be back in the kitchen. And I loved the part of my day where I was helping like portion out bread dough or like even like bag this like cinnamon swirl bread that they made that was so good. And so I just sort of gradually like worked my way back there and just fell in love with that scale of cooking and just being immersed in all the ingredients and the strange kind of camaraderie around like making food together in that space. And so I remember one night where there was like some kind of biscotti crisis. We like didn't have enough biscotti to fulfill the next morning's orders. And this was a really important account. And the maid baker was like on vacation or something. And I was like, I'll do it. And I like worked my full shift. And then I just stayed all night and made biscotti. And I was by myself blasting Leonard Skinner and just having like the best time ever. Got home at like 4:00 in the morning. And it was so great. I always like loved that environment. So I moved to New York in 2002, started college in Oregon, and then transferred to Hunter College here in New York. And the job that I got while I was in school was as a line and prep cook at this restaurant called the Blue Grotto on the Upper East Side. And same thing. I kind of like loved being in this like basement kitchen, even though it was hot, even though I was working when all my friends were playing, even though the pay was really bad. I just really like loved that. But once I graduated from school, I was like, I don't know if this is a viable career choice given the conditions, pay, hours. And so I worked in book publishing for about 10 years and sort of towards the end of that, went back to cooking in sort of like small catering situations. And I was waiting tables every now and then. And so there's a little bit of overlap. And towards the end of my time in book publishing, a colleague, a friend he went off to start his own publishing company called The Experiment. And he asked me one day if I knew anybody who could write a veggie burger cookbook. And I was like, oh, I've actually made a number of veggie burgers and I feel like I could do that. And so I just put together a proposal and I sent it to him and he was like, oh, this actually looks great. And I honestly thought it was just kind of like a one-off project to do while I figure out what my life was going to be. And then it turned out to sell well and I got to write another book and sort of that propelled me on this arm of my journey. Yeah.
I love that. It's interesting. I'm curious about this for you. I've heard this from Liz Pruitt, who I interviewed last season, who's a pastry chef, but she
I
talked
love
about.
that. I listened to that interview and I loved it.
Oh, she's amazing. She talked also about that sociability. Like she loved showing up in the pastry kitchen in the morning and being surrounded by the people that would come. And that's what first drew you into the work too, which I find fascinating. But now it sounds like much of the work that you do is solo or maybe
Totally.
at home. How does that feel for you? Have you kind of evolved with that? Or is there an element of the sociability that you miss?
Oh, I've never thought about that. Sometimes I work on photo shoots and I really crave that. I love that's the same type of camaraderie that I miss. But it is, it can be very lonely. And I find that like when my husband gets home from work, I'm like ready to chat.
Yeah.
But by and large, it's just like, I love the sociability and that definitely drew me to it. But I also love being on my feet. I love like the variety of things that I get to do. I sort of love going from my laptop to my stovetop to my laptop to my stovetop. And it's just a type of activity that kind of fuels me.
It sounds like you and I are very similar because same. I used to work as a food stylist in video production. And so that team element is so fun. And I taught cooking classes and it fuels you. And then it's like there's a season of your life where, we all change and grow. And now that I work solo, but I get to have these kind of conversations. And I guess to me, there's something about the depth. Like I really love going deep with people or with my own process or with my own recipes or my writing or whatever it is that maybe didn't matter to me so much when I was younger that I really find satisfying now. And sometimes it can be lonely work, but I guess it mirrors where I'm at, which is just interesting.
Well, I'd imagine your life is busy with kids. And
it is.
So now it's just like there's more of a premium on that ability to focus. And,
true. Very true. So you've written 4 cookbooks and you've co-authored some others, it sounds like. I am actually at the tail end of my 4th cookbook, but it's funny because here we are talking in late August 2024. Even though all of the content and recipes are done, this book doesn't come out until January of 2026. And we can talk about this lead time of cookbooks. But I would love to get into the cookbook writing process because I think people are kind of fascinated. Let's open the curtain a little bit. I'm sure you and I have very different processes, but I would love to hear from you. What does the cookbook process look like for you? And are you working on anything right now?
Yes, I am. I just finished my 6th cookbook.
Oh my gosh.
I have in that time co-authored 2. It's been nonstop cookbook.
Wow.
My process, I think of each cookbook as its own little ecosystem. So I spend a fair amount of time just thinking through what are the ingredients, what are the key ingredients, there's what are the A-list, B-list, C-list ingredients.
Yeah.
So because most of my stuff is so plant forward, I work with a farmer's market calendar next to me and make sure things are represented and sort of think about things seasonally throughout the table of contents. And then from that, I build out the recipe list and just make sure there's a variety of produce and a variety of seasonal, everything is sort of well matched timing wise for the year. And then I just kind of get to work and things change a lot as I'm working on them. Recipes will change. Sometimes even the philosophy of the book will change a little bit. But to me, a cookbook is project management. I think that's why I like it so much. I'm kind of a spreadsheet person. I like checking things off. I like being able to visualize in that format.
Yeah.
I think people talk about it as a creative endeavor, and it definitely is. But I think what draws me to it is it's sort of technical project managey. I'm going to work through this, and I'm able to stay really organized as I do it too.
Oh, that's so cool. It's funny because my computer, as we're recording, I have to prop my computer up, and what it's propped on is this giant binder filled, and it's my cookbook in printed form because I also love that technical side of it, and I have the spreadsheets, and they're color coded, and I'm I'm detail oriented until a point, and then it's total flow. But it's interesting because my last 3 books were all very topic driven. So as a food processor book, a bowl book, and I know you have a bowl book too, which I love and I own, and a slow cooker book. But this book that I'm writing came about so differently. And the book was almost my catalyst for getting out of the blog world because I felt very stifled as a blogger because I was writing content for Google and I felt like I lost my passion. I lost my voice. I literally lost my voice, which is really interesting for 2 months until this book idea came about, and it kind of morphed so slowly and it changed me as I was writing it. It was like the content was changing me as I was changing it, which was very different. So there's that side of it that was really, I had no expectations. I was writing the book just as a way for me to reconnect with my voice and with myself and with something deeper. And at the same time, somewhere along the line, you have to get into project management mode. Like if you're going to write a book, like once it became clear to me that I wanted to actually go for it and not just have this thing turn into the newsletter that but to actually create a tangible ecosystem with this thing. I think what a lot of people don't see is the incredible amount of detail, organization that goes into that. And like the testing of the recipes and the writing of the recipes, and then the recipes are changing. And then are you, like you said, like, are you representing the ingredients, enough of a variety of ingredients, or do you have 7 chicken recipes in the same chapter? For you, I know you love that management, that project management, but in the day-to-day, like, do you have a day-to-day schedule when you're writing a book, or does it change daily? Are you testing recipes one day, writing another day, or is it kind of like wake up and see where you're at?
I just want to say I'm very curious what this new book is, because my last book is a bread machine cookbook, which is my first sort of appliance-oriented project. And I didn't know you had done a food processor cookbook, but I knew about the slow cooker one. So it sounds like this is a very different type of project that you're doing.
Yes.
Can you say more, or is it?
I can. Yeah. This book is more about using the process of cooking as a way to connect to yourself and to hone into your intuition. So it's more about the process. And of course, it has recipes and all of that stuff, but it's less about here. This book is going to help you feed your family. And, like my slow cooker book, like here's this problem. Feeding our families is challenging, and slow cooker recipes often are terrible. So I'm going to solve this problem through this book by using fresh ingredients, accessible recipes. This book still has that, but the umbrella behind it is a little bit more esoteric. Like, let's use this process of being in the kitchen to take us into ourselves and to connect to ourselves. But, the recipes are still approachable and all of that.
Yeah. I love that idea because, like, I wrote my book Start Simple with my brother and my sister-in-law, who have 2 kids, my nieces. And I wrote it with them in mind because they're constantly struggling to just do home cooked meals. And so they buy all this stuff at Costco. A lot of food ends up going to waste, or they order it takeout, and I'm just like, how can I break this down to be helpful? And I know that I have a vastly different lifestyle that makes it a lot easier for me to cook dinner every night. But I'm like, what would be the thing that can kind of like be the breakthrough moment?
Yeah.
And it's hard to communicate in a cookbook because I feel like when you're talking to somebody who's reading a cookbook, you already have established that, like, okay, you're kind of a food person. So like you want to be doing this, you like to cook. But if you don't necessarily like to cook, or you want to like to cook, but you're not there yet, I think the answer is to like really think of it as a practice. And it's like going to yoga. It's like brushing your teeth every day. It's like saving money. It's like, I'm sure it's like raising kids, where it's like the cumulative impact of like doing it every day. That's what's going to like build the muscle and like build the desire and build the interest in doing it. And then ultimately like making that choice the default choice, rather than sort of like, do I cook dinner for myself, or can we just like order something from the place around the corner?
Gosh, I've never thought about that. It's totally habit change, isn't it? It's like, on average, it takes 66 days to rewire the neural pathways in our brain. And committing to cooking, it's not like, I don't feel like we have to be so dogmatic and be like, I'm going to cook every day for 66 days, because there's no fun in that. But it is a practice. Like my daughter is playing soccer now, and she started last year and she was the worst on her team. And she's just so committed to learning this sport. And it's such a good parable for me, or such a good analogy for me, and so many other things. So I'm like, look at how far you've come. Like, wow. And the same totally applies to feeding ourselves.
Yeah.
Which I hadn't really, I guess, connected those dots. Like, it's a habit that we can form, and of course there's many barriers that people face to feeding themselves. But if without some of those barriers, probably many of the listeners here have access to fresh food and have access to at least a little bit of time and a kitchen space and all of those things, then it can become a habit instead of a chore.
Especially when trying to like change eating habits. If you say eat more vegetables or any type of eating plan, I think nothing will change immediately. It changes over time, and just sort of committing to that reality of it.
Yeah, exactly. Things take time, and we live in a culture where we want like the instant whole house renovation in 24 hours. My kids were watching a show where literally they renovate a house in 24 hours. And I'm like, this is everything that's wrong with this culture.
Yeah.
There's so many things that I want to ask you about, but I do want to circle back. So you just wrote this bread book, which is very interesting because I can't imagine the amount of bread that came out of your house. Mm-hmm. What does the process look like? What does a day-to-day look like for you? Just like bring us through your day.
Well, I'm usually managing a few different types of projects every week. And so for long-term projects like a book, I'll block off like a writing day or a cooking day. I have like day-long projects if it's some kind of like freelance thing. Best case scenario, every Sunday night, I sort of sit down. I'm like, okay, here's my Monday, here's my Tuesday, here's my Wednesday, here's when I'm going to do my grocery shopping. Here's I'm spending this entire day in the kitchen, and I just try to like block it off that way. I have to be pretty flexible about it because things change. Every week is different.
Yeah.
Once the recipe development is all done, then it's sort of like in testing mode, and I can do that sort of in between while I'm so it'll be like half a day of writing, and then I'll test one or two recipes afterwards, and then that'll be dinner, so it's sort of like pacing that out. And then other times it's like a recipe is just not there. And so it ends up taking like 2 days and just doing over and over and over again until I get it right. And I have to kind of like be ready to do that. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say.
So there was like one recipe in my book that I think I tested it 7 times. And my family was about to kill me because of course, we eat all this food. But there was finally this point where I had to surrender and say, this is just not working. And what was interesting about that experience is I was getting close to my deadline. So I was like trying to force this square peg into a round hole. Like, this is the recipe. And I think it was the next day I was making dinner, and it was like a light bulb. And I was like, oh, let's try this. And I just tried something else, and it ended up being one of my favorite recipes in the book.
Oh, that's awesome.
Have you ever had that experience? Have you ever had to just kind of give up on a recipe? And if you have, how did you know, like, okay, this is just not going anywhere?
Years ago, I went to a cooking class with the cookbook author, Marie Simmons.
Oh, yeah. I know Marie.
And she had done, I was like, Fresh and Fast Vegetarian was the book that she had just written. And I remember her saying, she's like, she has an idea for a recipe. I draft it out before I start cooking it. So I have like something to like reference. So you make it the first time, and then you have to like usually do a few tweaks. And then if you make it the second time, it should be like, that this doesn't require a whole lot more to be like what you want it to be, at least in savory. I think baking stuff probably requires a lot more. I know baking requires a lot more finessing, but that kind of stuck with me that like if by the second try on a savory recipe, it's not working, you probably need to start over.
Wow, that simplifies things for me.
Yeah. And I was like, she's done a lot of this. I think she knows what she's talking about.
That's so smart because there is always... So the thing is with this recipe is there was 2 versions. Every recipe in my book has 2 versions. And the first I really liked. And the second I was like, it was like almost like my ego. Like now that we're talking, I'm like, I just wanted to like prove that I could get it and I could like master it. And no, after that second try, I absolutely knew in my gut probably that like, this isn't going to go anywhere. I'm going to do a better job of listening.
Well, I mean, you got it there. So, maybe that rule doesn't really apply everywhere.
Yeah. Well, so where do you find your recipe inspiration?
It comes from all over the place. Oftentimes it's like farmers market oriented with like produce. I oftentimes think of a recipe as having like a star ingredient, whether it's like produce or maybe it's just beans or maybe it's like halloumi or something. And that I work backwards from there. I think that a lot of my inspiration actually just comes from like opening up the fridge and being like, what do I need to cook right now? And at least like, especially my newsletter, it's been so nice with doing my newsletter where I do a recipe every week and it can be so in the moment. Whereas the cookbook is, as you were saying, you're working on it and that thing's not going to be out for another 2 years.
Yeah.
Maybe, and I can really just like let the fridge be my guide, let the crisper be my guide in generating recipes that way. I skim cookbooks a lot. I love like all the food activity on the internet. I feel like I'm what's called a geriatric millennial. I was born in 1982.
I was born in 81.
Okay. So you're like, then you're is that millennial still? Or
I think it is. I think it starts in 81, which is
okay.
Very strange to me, but yeah.
I was actually really inspired by Gen Z and this whole new school of cookbook authors. I feel like the entire time I've been writing vegetarian cookbooks, there's been this dogma attached to it with this sort of insistence on like purity of like you're vegan, you're plant-based, you're vegetarian, or plant-based as a newer thing, but like you're vegan or you're vegetarian and like these are hard and fast rules.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of like, eggs or is there rennet in the cheese or like just getting into like the sort of granular of like the dogma of it.
Yeah.
And I find that like right now there's so many people that are just doing this really exciting, it feels liberated, this like sort of vegetable forward stuff that's like super exciting and it has none of the like attachment to ideology.
Yeah.
In a lot of my stuff, I've been trying to like do that and I feel like I'm still sort of stuck in that. And maybe it's just like my age and like the period in which I've been writing cookbooks, but it seems like that's just one thing is there's the liberation from the ideology of like if it's vegetarian, vegan, but also it's just like the liberation of combining all these different cuisines and pulling influences from so many places. And so anyway, I follow a bunch of people on Instagram and Substack and I'm just like, oh, this is really cool what they're doing. This feels so fresh and new to me. And I'm like learning so much.
I so agree and so resonate with you, like the liberation in recipe development. And for me, it's the liberation from this, what is healthy and what is not healthy, because, I can't, and also like, I can't eat gluten. And I didn't even for my blog, which from Scratch Fast, I never even wanted to call it a gluten-free blog because it's food that just happens to be gluten-free.
Yeah.
Like I didn't want to.
There's so much food that's gluten-free.
I know.
That you wouldn't even take the class.
Honestly, it was like, that wasn't the right choice. I probably should have really, really honed in onto that little niche. And I get it. Like, I get why people want to have like a super tight niche. But for me, it feels so small, like a label, even calling myself gluten-free. I'm like, I don't have celiac. So I can say, maybe one day I'll be able to eat gluten. I don't want to shut that door on myself. Like, but those labels can be so binding. And I totally agree. There's this freedom that I see this trend towards that is, well, at least from my perspective, like eat what makes you feel good, end of the story. But also like, let's stop putting these labels on everything. Like in the blog, part of the reason I started hating it so much is like from an SEO, search engine optimization standpoint, if I threw the word healthy in, if I threw the word paleo in, if I threw the word vegan in, it would perform so much better. And that's what my income was based on, was that performance, that ad performance. So I was kind of like labeling these recipes in a way that was like so destroying my soul.
Yeah.
But they performed a lot better when I put them in those little buckets,
Yeah.
And that's kind of the great thing about Substack and like, us writing these newsletters now. It's like I can just write whatever I want. I care about how my readers resonate with it and if it's useful, but I don't have to care about if they can find it when they Google peach crisp or something.
Yeah. I don't know. There's something to that business model is so, on the one hand, it's like what incredible opportunity for people who've really figured out how to hack it. And it really like illuminates something about like how people look for recipes too, that I'm sure that you must have learned a lot in like cracking the SEO thing, but it doesn't jibe with like who we are as humans,
right?
as creating these things.
And I loved how you said like the reality of recipe development, the reason I love developing recipes is because when I open my fridge and I don't know what's for dinner and I get to fall into my creative brain and I get to create something, that is the joy. So when I had to come from recipe development to say, oh, I really want to do a recipe for X and Y, but it could never perform. I can't afford to do that because of the amount of time and effort it takes to do that recipe. I won't get that payment back. And so like that's part of where my creativity was stifled. Instead of saying, let's go to the farmer's market, let's see what's available and let's create something. It can just be for the sake of creating something delicious instead of like it has to achieve this amount of searches per month and all of that stuff. Back to that for you, you've mentioned a few times that one of your specialties, and this is, I know about you and I love your recipes, is that you are vegetable forward. Are you a vegetarian? And why vegetables?
I'm not a vegetarian anymore. It is kind of like my default way of eating, but I'm not strict about it. And I've just always been very inspired by vegetables. It's like a way of cooking that never gets boring to me. I feel like every cuisine has like something new to learn about vegetable-oriented cooking. And yeah, no, I haven't been a vegetarian for a little while, but I do find, I mean, maybe this is related to what you're saying about sort of writing recipes for SEO, but I do find that it's an area that people continue to need guidance on, whether they are becoming vegetarians or whether they just want to eat more vegetables. And so I do think of my work as like service work. And I want to like be helpful to people. I want to teach people how to cook. I want to teach them how to not waste food. I want to teach them how to enjoy being in the kitchen and, you know, be really efficient and resourceful there. And so I've sort of stuck with I've stuck with the vegetarian thing. I also feel like there's more of a need there to teach people.
What are some of your tips for families or people who are looking to incorporate more vegetables into their diet? Do you have any suggestions or tips to get people excited about vegetarian cooking?
Well, the thing that I always tell people for whom it seems like a very daunting project to eat more vegetables is just to start with what you know. And as we were saying before, like you can't like overnight suddenly have a whole new appetite. I think it happens incrementally. So start with what you know. If you're really into Italian food, start with pasta, lasagna. I mean, these are all like delicious things. I wouldn't shy away from, you know, maybe if you're vegan, that might work. It's like maybe with vegan, you start with chili or you start with more like bowl-oriented food, but with flavors that you know and textures that you know. There's probably a lot of like vegetables that you already like, and I'd start there and then incrementally explore new things, stay curious, and just, you know, give yourself time to sort of develop a new palate. And then I feel like it's also, this isn't like a fun answer, but so much of the hurdle around eating a lot of fresh vegetables is like, it actually is just more work. There's more prep. They take up more space in the fridge. They go bad. They don't always freeze as well. So I think that when you have the time, when you have some downtime during the week, when you have downtime on the weekend, you will thank yourself later for getting some of the prep out of the way, doing the cleaning, packing everything up in your fridge so that it's ready to go. Just eliminate that hurdle when you can. And then, you know, I wrote my book, Start Simple, is all about these sort of like vegetarian building blocks. And so there's things like, you know, marinating hearty greens. So like cooking down a bunch of kale and then seasoning it with a little olive oil and some acid and some chili flakes and garlic or whatever. And then packing that up so you have this like these greens that are like ready to eat, or cooking off a big pot of beans, or like roasting off a bunch of squash. And then just having those things there, it just makes it so much easier when the time comes to cook dinner and you're like, oh, one less thing I have to do is like clean the greens or cook this, you know, hack up that squash and deal with it.
Those are such great tips. And I love your tip about getting things cleaned. Like this is always what I tell people who are struggling, even, you know, they're like, I have a farm share for the first time or farmer's market. My biggest tip is to get home, you know, for the things that you can clean ahead of time, do it. I do it all. Then all of our greens get washed. The salad greens get spun. Like we just knock it out. And that way it's done, because you're right. That one little thing makes a massive difference when I can just pull out the kale, slice it, and saute it. I'm terrible at meal prep. I
Me
don't
too.
love doing it, but I do get all of the produce ready to go. And so it's like that little barrier of having like washing lettuce greens. You don't want to do that on a Tuesday night at 5:30 or 6.
It's like anything that requires a salad spinner. I'm just like, that to me is, I like look at that thing with like daggers in my eyes. It's like, just do it immediately.
So this kind of leads to my last question, where this episode is going to be airing in September. So we're heading towards fall, which has me so excited. Any kind of like tips for fall produce, or maybe share a few recipes of yours that are your favorite using some of the fall highlights?
Well, as I said, I really love all the winter squashes. I think they're so beautiful to look at and always so delicious. One of the things that I do a lot when the squash is in season is, rather than like cube it up and roast it so that it's like bites, I just roast them whole with like some butternut squash or kabocha or any of them really. So cut them in half through the stem, scoop out the seeds, roast them face down, and then flip them over for the last 10 minutes or so. And then I just scoop all the flesh out and pack it into a container, and it's like roasted squash ready to go. Mm-hmm. And I'll mix that into eggs and make a frittata. I'll incorporate it into some of my baking sometimes. Sometimes it'll just be like, I have a rice cooker that I really love. And so scooping out little like rustic blobs of roasted squash and putting that over like a grain bowl. And it just, I don't know. To me, that tastes like fall, and it's always really delicious.
Love that idea.
And then I'm really into like the savory baking of the fall. Like I love galettes. I could eat one of those like all year long, but the fall is when I'm ready to like fire up my oven and throw some cheese in there and whatever. It's like Brussels sprouts or squash or greens or lots of caramelized onions. I get really excited about that in the fall. What are your fall go-tos?
You know, it's so funny that you said galettes, because as my listeners might know, like pie is my favorite food. I love making pie. I love making galettes. I have a butternut squash galette, a spinach galette, but the same thing, I think you can take these concepts and, you know, even if you find a recipe, to then make it your own with what you have, like butter, like you said, like Brussels sprouts, like why not? Like throw some Brussels sprouts in there, shave Brussels sprouts, maybe saute them. I think it's all about the root vegetables for me when I start thinking of fall. It's like getting the oven back on and roasting up trays of vegetables, and maybe like I pile chicken on them one night, or we put them into grain bowls one night, or we toss them into like a warm panzanella salad one night. But I think that's one of my favorite things that I look forward to. And then the baking as well. I was just writing my newsletter that's coming out tomorrow. It's a zucchini cake, but I was like getting so jived up about baking and like the apples and the cinnamon and the chocolate and, you know, all of that warmth, and the darker nights just make me want to putter around the kitchen a little bit more and play with these ingredients.
Also soup and beans. It's like in the summer, because I'm in New York, it's like a small kitchen and the apartment heats up so quickly. And I cook all my beans in the slow cooker because it contains the heat a lot better than the stovetop does. Once it gets cool, like there's nothing better to me than a pot of beans simmering on the stove for an hour. And then that's just such a nice ingredient to incorporate all week long, and like make soup and get back into making vegetable broths and just all that long simmery stuff. Is what I get excited about.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because even though I love canned beans, dried beans, cooking your own beans is such a game changer. They are so incredibly delicious, and it's not hard. It's just, you got to let the thing bubble away and, you know, do its thing.
Slow cooker is really good I mean, you must know this, but like some of my best beans.
It's so funny because I have an Instant Pot. I only use it for beans. I've never kind of gotten on the Instant Pot bandwagon, but I never use my slow cooker for beans. So you're kind of blowing my mind right now. Give me the process.
Oh, man. So I usually soak, but obviously you don't always have to. I do the slow cook setting. I have an Instant Pot that I use as a slow cooker.
Okay.
And then cover them with, if they're soaked, they don't need as much water. But if they're unsoaked, you want to like give them plenty of water to cover. I'll throw in a handful of bay leaves and garlic broken into cloves. I just leave the skins on because they end up becoming caramelized, and then you squeeze them out into the bean broth, and it's really delicious. A good amount of salt. And then it's like sometimes they're done in 4 hours, sometimes they're done in 8 hours. The nice thing about the slow cooker versus the pressure cooker is that you can stop and check really easily and then taste and add more salt and whatnot. But, It's so good for chickpeas in particular. And like
Okay.
the garlic that cooks in there with
Yeah.
it's, oh my God, it's so delicious.
Oh, Lukas, you're making me so hungry. Well, thank you so much. I would love just if you could share where people can find you. And then I've got one last question for you before we sign off.
I have a weekly newsletter called Family Friend. It's on Substack. It's lucasvolger.substack.com. And then I am on Instagram, though I don't know if anybody sees anything anymore, but it's my name, Lukas Volger.
Awesome. Okay. So last question that I also ask all of my guests. It's your last meal on earth. In this moment, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, I honestly think maybe it's just because we were talking about this, but like a bowl of freshly cooked brothy beans that are perfectly seasoned. Maybe I would incorporate some like slow roasted tomatoes into that and throw a little bit of, I know, some kind of fresh cheese and a lot of really good olive oil
Mm-hmm.
and then like a really nice slice of like grilled bread.
I know what I'm making for dinner tonight. Literally, I want that for dinner tonight.
Maybe an egg instead of the cheese, like a poached egg. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.